Welcome everyone to today's Australia-Taiwan Dialogue. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Today's event is proudly presented by the Taiwan Center for Security Studies and Asialink. Before we begin the formal proceedings today, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all dialing in from and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today's dialogue will be recorded and available to view on Asialink's YouTube channel. If you have any questions for any of the panelists throughout, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we will endeavour to answer these towards the end of the session. I will now introduce our co-moderators for today. Mr. Paul Zhong is the former head of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Tel-Aviv, and Mr. Colin Heseltine is a senior advisor with us here at Asialink. Colin has had a 41-year career at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where he served as the senior representative at the Australian office in Taiwan, among other senior positions. I will now hand over to Colin to begin today's dialogue.
Thanks very much, Aaliyah. I think all of us can agree that Taiwan poses for Australia arguably its biggest foreign policy challenge. All countries of the Asia-Pacific region face similar challenges, but each has its own national security environment and interests and will have different approaches to it. Australia's position is shaped by its security alliance with China's main economic, military and diplomatic competitor, the United States. At the same time, China is Australia's #1 trading partner. After some years of seriously chilled relations with China, Australia now wants to stabilise its relations with that country and to try to develop a less fraught relationship. Its official line is cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and engage in our national interest. At the same time, Taiwan is an important economic partner of Australia, a major destination for Australia's energy and resources exports, which are vital for Taiwan. Taiwan is also a democracy whose people have freedoms similar to those enjoyed by Australians and who wish to hold on to these. So what does a country like Australia do? How far can or should Australia go in supporting Taiwan? Australia can and does, in concert with other countries, convey support for Taiwan's status quo, thereby supporting Taiwan as a going concern and entity able to conduct business with the rest of the world, albeit without formal diplomatic relations. But can we do more? Should we do more? Will it make a difference in supporting the status quo? What does Taiwan expect of a country like Australia? Does giving Taiwan more international space actually help secure its position? These are some of the questions which we will cover in the next hour and a half during this dialogue. The dialogue itself is really divided into two parts. The first part is really going to be presentations from our TCSS speakers, basically setting the scene about the current state of cross-state relations, given that we had the presidential election in Taiwan earlier this year. It's another DPP administration, but all this time, the DPP does not have a majority in the legislative yuan. So the big question as to how this will play into not just domestic politics in Taiwan, but in terms of how it conducts relations across the strait. The second part of the dialogue will be the Australian speakers basically speaking on Australia's relationship with Taiwan, how it conducts its relations, and whether it should or could do more, and what the impact of this would be in terms of its relations with China. So on that brief introductory note, I'd just like to perhaps hand over to my co-moderator, Paul Zhong, who might introduce the Taiwan speakers. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I just very happy to meet our friend in Asialink in Australia today. And let me introduce our speaker first. First Lady Dr. Minyoung Chang, who received her PhD in Boston University, and currently is a deputy director of the Taiwan Center for Security Study. Her specialty is cross-strait economic exchange and geo-economic challenge to Taiwan. And the second one I'd like to introduce is Dr. Yuan Yi. Dr. Yuan Yi received his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Currently, he's a Johnson Research Fellow. Also, he teaches in the Taiwan University, National Taiwan University. And his specialty is political science theory and also the U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. And next, Dr. Fu Guoliu received his PhD in University Hall in UK. And currently, he's a director of our Security Study Center. He also is the one to organize this webinar today. So later, we're gonna proceed to the part one. We have 30 minutes.
Yep.
So each speaker on our side will have 5 to 7 minute presentation. And after that, maybe your side speaker can make a comment. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Paul. I'll just at this stage briefly introduce the Australian speakers, and then we'll proceed to the first part of the dialogue. The Australian speakers first mentioned Dr. Sao-Kit Tok, who's a lecturer at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. His research is focused on China and its policy behaviour towards sovereignty, with particular attention to China-Taiwan relations. Then Beck Strouting, who's director of La Trobe Asia and professor of international relations at La Trobe University in Melbourne. She currently leads the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade-funded Blue Security Network, focused on maritime security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Her research focuses primarily on Asian regional security, maritime disputes, and Australian foreign and defence policy. And then we have Hugh White, I think is well known to all of you. Hugh is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. He was formerly the Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and Head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. Hugh, of course, is one of Australia's foremost writers and commentators on national security issues. So now, Paul, I'll hand back to you, and we can start the first part of the dialogue.
Okay, now it's our first session. The topic is the current state of the cross-strait relation. So we have 3 speakers. Who's gonna make first?
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here, sharing some of my observations as well as learning from you all. My main topic will focus on the economic side. I have 3 key points to share with you. Number 1, Taiwan's economy is facing 5 major challenges of resource insufficiency: water, electricity, land, workers, and human talents. A blessing in disguise of the recent Typhoon Demis catastrophe in Taiwan has somewhat unexpectedly eased our nerve on water supply for this year. Taiwan's energy policies have been hijacked by political gimmick of no nuke homeland for the past 8 years, supported by the Pan Green coalition. President Lai seems to be realistic enough to consolidate his limited fundamental constituency with rhetorics on the one hand, and also appears to welcome some policy change on the other hand. We are weathering energy policy readjustment by some observations in the following. Number 1, world high-tech leaders gathered in Taiwan 2 months ago with investment pledges, which require sufficient electricity power supply Number two, Nobel laureate Dr. Li Yanze and high-tech guru Mr. Tong Zhixian have all urged the support of nuclear power generation and are recruited to be seated in the Climate Change Committee by the Lai government. Number three, license renewal for the nuclear power plants and the disposal of nuclear waste are under legislative review. Inevitably, the battles of the LY legislative yuan will probably continue with lots of bargaining games. My number two observation, the cross-strait trade dependency has decreased from 42% to the recent 30%, partly due to the geo-economic dynamics stemmed from the US-China trade wars and technology wars, and particularly due to Beijing's retract or partially from some tariff exemption treatment from ECFA previously orchestrated under Ma government. We are now
Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement.
Yes. Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. Yes. So we're now witnessing some exodus of Taiwanese businessmen from mainland China to ASEAN countries and Taiwan. It seems that the Lai government, either by self-enlightenment or under some US advice, is toning down the irritating anti-China rhetorics and is arranging some lower rank official contacts for the fishing boat incidents recently, as well as some anticipated opening up of two-way tourist flow. My number three key point, Taiwan has continued to engage in collaborating with our regional trade partners and neighbors in order to maintain economic prosperity. The green industry, healthcare industry, as well as software design are particularly active in our regional collaborative efforts. That's my contribution at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chang. So next, Dr. Bill.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking Asialink and also Colin for making such a great effort, connecting Australian experts together with Taiwanese as well as our friends in the region. I'm so delighted to see such a focus working on the cross-strait relations. I would have a quick point. I want to focus on two specific areas. The first one, since President Lai Ching-te inaugurated in May, and up to this moment, whether there should be a positive expectation to the future of the cross-strait relations. I basically look into the next few years. I don't have such a optimistic view because there are three specific points. Number one, when people are asking if our government is now opening up the possibility to dialogue with China, I should say it is almost impossible during President Lai's term. It is simply because currently there is no common political ground between Beijing and China, Beijing and Taipei. I don't want to get into the details of one China things, but basically there is no common political agenda for the two sides. The second point is the relations looking down the road in the next 4 years. It is going to get much worse and also more tense and even more difficult for Taipei and Beijing. The third observation would be obviously looking into the substance of cross-strait relations. We can expect from the political dimension, from military dimension, as well as from economic dimension. China would obviously frequently take this as normalizing the exercise or implementation, putting all the pressures on the shoulder of President Lai Ching-te. So basically, these 3 points joined together, we can expect this is something on the real ground, the Taiwan Strait. But I have to quickly wrap up on this particular point. There would be more political pressures than military pressures. So we should not really immediately connect with the military invasion is coming all the way very soon, happening by 2027. So my observation is the difficult is obviously very clear, but the security challenge may not as close as others considers. So let me quickly move on to the second point. I want to quickly touch upon President Lai Ching-te's domestic difficulty at this moment, or we can say domestic political tension. As I can see, on the day, May 20th, President Lai started with his term, opening up 2 battlegrounds. The first one is Taiwan and China. The second one is ruling party, DPP, openly opening up this confrontation against 2 major opposition parties. And then a few weeks later, he opened up the third battleground within his own party, different factions. So this is what we see for now. Taiwan's domestic politics is very difficult because our president is now at siege with this oil issue coming around. So putting in front, if Donald Trump presumably comes back later next year, it will change the game and probably will cause more for our government to go in the next 3-some years. But basically, if we are asking what they may impact on Taiwan's external policy, my easy answer is it would literally cripple the current government's international effort. Because with this very tense relations between Taipei and Beijing, obviously on the diplomatic side or official side, the government obviously cannot go much further. Especially the government depends so much on the United States to find the anchorage outside of Taiwan. So as I can see, with this domestic tension and difficulties, obviously the opposition party openly challenge the government. So either defense policy or our international policy will not be able to go as smooth as President Tsai, his predecessors, went. So this would be something critically important for us to remember to begin with. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Dr. Rennie.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All right, the last 30 years, I've been working on cross-strait relations, one or the other. For the next few minutes, I'd like to share my observation, the latest about the Taiwanese, the very genesis of the Taiwanese current situation, also the prospect for the cross-strait relations in a nutshell. I think to our surprise, the ruling party, although it did not enjoy the mandate, and yet the current leadership under the DPP is so skillfully manipulated their strategy to reinforce the likelihood that the political longevity of their next 4 years rule. That is, they are thinking about how to prolong their next victory put into in that perspective in focus, I think there's an easy way to realize the very strategy. Unlike the KNT in the past, the KNT took the so-called walk with two legs. That is to maintain a balance between the U.S. and also with China, and mainland China. And yet the TPP will only focus on this relation externally with the United States in general, and then with the West in particular, with the United States in particular, and the West in general. And yet it will focus on the 40% of its core supporters, all right? They would like to exploit the possibility to foster even more support of next election. That is to secure the 40% of the domestic supporters. That matters. Unless they can secure their support, they won't be able to prolong their political journey for the next 4 years. Therefore, they will very much to confront China by all means. So I do not foresee any prospect of the next 4 years that the relation across Taiwan Strait will be alleviated. The tension will be alleviated unless the U.S. impose some pressure on Taiwan. Well, that was subject to who will be the host of the White House in a few months. I think that would be subject to see the next president of the United States' position on the cross relation. But also, to our surprise, the TPP has also demonstrated very skillfully, by exercising their political prerogative, using the so-called constitution court to overrule whatever being passed at the parliament. That's something. That's another very interesting area for us to watch for the years to come. Under the situation at this current tense, the cross relation look very unhealthy, quote unquote, and promising. And for China, for Beijing, I think that they still adopt a very similar posture. They try to, invest the hope of next generation, so they will continue to invite young Taiwanese to visit China, cultivating more, general sentiment amongst the young generation. I think that's the welcome sign for them to do. And yet, this is only one way of communication. I worry very much as we speak, there's no whatsoever viable channel between two capitals, all right, between Beijing and Taipei, as how to manage any potential crisis. I think that's the very worrisome sign for both sides of Taiwan Strait and also for the rest of the world to watch. I think that would be, the core. That would be very important, area to look into as we speak, especially from your perspective. So what I argue is so far, the DPP will focus domestically, all right? Domestic overrule the cross-strait relations. That would be the important gesture, and by all means. And also, after the White House is under the new leadership, the Taiwan will tailor to whatever offered by Beijing, by the U.S. to make a necessary, readjustment if needed. All right, that shall be, subject to debate to see who will be in control. All right. Well, that's my first round of the observation for you to consider. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for that. And I think the three speakers have painted a fairly tough environment in which third countries like Australia will conduct their relations their interchanges with Taiwan. I think we can probably generally accept the principle that the easier relations are between across the strait, the greater flexibility might be available to third countries in developing their unofficial relations with Taiwan. But the picture that you've painted, I think, is quite a severe one, and I think very fascinating. The last speaker, Yuan, how domestic considerations, domestic political considerations override the cross-strait relations. That's a fascinating insight. So maybe I just invite the Australian side to either comment, ask questions, or however you'd like to handle it. Beck, you're on mute, Beck. So. Yeah.
I'll take myself off mute. Thank you to the panelists. It's great to hear those insights, and I just think it's quite interesting to hear the perspective that things are going to be tense across the next 4 years in terms of cross-strait relations. I had an opportunity to visit Taiwan late last year, and we were asking a lot of questions of defence experts about this critical kind of 2027 date, which seems to have really occupied the thinking of people in Washington, that this was going to mean that, you know, China would be ready for an invasion. It seems from the comments from the panelists that that's not necessarily the case, that even though things might be very tense over the next 4 years, that's not necessarily going to mean that that Beijing, China is going to be able to invade Taiwan. So I was hoping to just get the views of the panelists on that 2027 date and what it means, and what the feeling is in Taipei about that. And I was also surprised when I was in Taiwan to sort of hear that some defence experts may consider that the South China Sea is potentially more of a kind of burning flashpoint at the moment. And so I was wondering about Taiwan's role in the other flashpoints of East Asia, including the South China Sea. Obviously, there is a lot going on in the Second Thomas Shoal, and Taiwan has its own maritime and territorial claims in the South China Sea, but also, you know, in other areas, whether it's the Korean Peninsula or the East China Sea. So that would be sort of, I guess, a second question that I'm very curious to hear about. And the third is really a question about what Taiwan might want from regional partners, whether it's Australia or Japan or Korea. What is it that that these countries can do to sort of alleviate or de-escalate in, you know, given this really tense situation between Taiwan and mainland China? Sorry, that's a lot of questions, but thank you very much for the opportunity for me to ask them.
Just before we get responses from the Taiwan panel, maybe that last part about what other countries can do or might do, perhaps we could leave that question until we've done the second part of the dialogue and open it up. Might be because I think that'll be a fairly key part of that discussion. So perhaps on the Taiwan panel, over to you.
Yes, all right. Let me respond. The last question is how could the original partner to be you know, expect do something on behalf of Taiwan's yawning for international assistance. I would argue Australia actually in the past has already did something that is under the aegis of Australia Group /CWC. I think the given your leadership in the Australia Group, as the export control regime active member. So I'm looking forward to see more aggressive, more functional assistance from Australia in that particular issues, all right, to facilitate Taiwan's need and also to expand Taiwan's, possibility to participate to those not necessarily governmental fora. But the NGOs fora will be, always welcome for us to accommodate Taiwan's participation on the very, very subject matters.
Thank you so much, Beck, for your very profound questions. After you elaborate these few questions, I thought maybe we should request a colleague to call upon another lengthy discussion. Basically, there are two specific key areas. The first one is a 2027 concept. The second one is South China Sea. I think my colleagues with me here, we should have a lot to talk about this. The first one about 2027. Basically, this idea carries through just among military sectors. Basically, those information has been alerted by the United States and Japan. From time to time, they emphasize, especially from military perspective. But as a result, of course, the government follows through and prepare for the worst to come. We are now putting a lot of great efforts on the defense budget, as well as lift up our preparedness currently, moving on. But I think this is just very much among security community and also military experts now. But in a wider security community, as my colleague and I elaborated during the first part of our presentation, we thought this idea obviously is very clear. People Liberation Army is getting everything prepared. But politically, personally, I don't think it is coming that soon, because my TCSS, together with a number of experts, we have conducted 2 rounds of tabletop exercise early on. We went through the process and we discovered invasion would cost too much for China. And there are other easier means for China to conduct, to either put on these pressures, coercive measures and all that. So this would be something. I know, as you mentioned, 2027 is now prevailing in Washington, D.C. Many experts are now talking about this, trying to connect with airlines to get something worse to prepare for. So this is the first one. Let me maybe quickly respond to the second question about South China Sea. I think your question really put our government in a very awkward situation. As we all know, Taiwan is claimed South China Sea all along since the end of the Second World War. And we stayed strongest strategic post in Taipei Island, Ituaba, for long. So in this sense, the current government in Taiwan, because for political reason, they have tried to cool down and also weaken our presence in the South China Sea. So a group of leading experts in Taiwan on the South China Sea frequently remind our government we need to react in response to the incident surrounding Second Thomas Shelf as well as Scarborough Shelf, which China and the Philippines are now engaging with each other. Good or bad, our policy has not been changed. So literally, as you rightly asked, where is Taiwan's role in the South China Sea? I think politically, we are just voluntarily withdrew to be tough here and especially domestically during the last 8 years under President Tsai Ing-wen. He was advocating the new southbound policy, in a way trying to connect with all Southeast Asian countries and trying to tone down such a disputes and controversial issue with our neighbors. But I don't think that many leading experts in this country do not think this is a right approach. So I'm happy that you have brought up this issue because in the interest of time, I cannot elaborate more. But I do think our government is now quietly and informally sending and strengthening our position in the islands surrounding and also reef in the South China Sea. We are preparing for the worst, but we haven't just come out to the public what we have been doing in Taiping Island as well as Dongshan, Pratas Islands. So let me stop here quickly. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes. Let me say something. Last week I was in China, okay? And one retired official told me, with our military capacity, we just need 2 days to take care of Taiwan. Currently, they are considering the sanction. So they're watching Ukraine war very carefully. What kind of sanction they can bear? That's what I heard from them. So this is my observation. So we have 1 minute for this section.
So, Hugh or Salki, do you have any?
Could I raise a question, if I may, Colin?
Please.
Look, thank you very much to our Taiwanese colleagues. A really interesting set of presentations and responses. I wonder if I could ask you your interpretations of the present state of US policy on the question of strategic ambiguity. Because one of the distinctive things about the Biden administration has been the way in which Biden himself, I think 4 times whilst he's been president, has appeared to breach the long-standing principle of strategic ambiguity by making a very plain statement that the US would in fact defend Taiwan were it to be attacked by China. And yet his officials have then gone on to reassert the sanctity, the endurance of the strategic ambiguity policy. So we now seem to have ambiguity about ambiguity in US policy. Now, particularly on the basis that I think we'd expect a Harris administration, should there be such a thing, to maintain a lot of the policy settings and probably a lot of the personnel of the Biden administration. I'd be very interested in Taiwanese perceptions of where you think America has got to on what does seem to us, of course, a very critical question.
As we read any possibility of the new administration of the United States, personality matters, all right, is who will be on which post. But on average, the Taiwanese regard that there will be some continuity should the Democrat continue to empower. So they have already get used to their practice. They knew the person well, and also they cultivated heavily with them. So the simple answer for your question is the continuity per se, policy continuity under Democratic administration. And however, for the very concept being created and be duplicated too long, that is ambiguity versus an ambiguity, I discover that it has already turned into the nature of that very concept into as opposite set. I think that for Taiwan, we accept whatever, all right, on average, the both party, the ruling party, the opposition party, take whatever been spelled from Washington, D.C. And yet, what make a difference is the way that Beijing perceived the political rhetoric generated by U.S. politicians. I think that make a lot of differences. But for us, it's a business as usual, because with the diminishing of our international space, all right, we realized this international space for Taiwan is shrinking. Therefore, we are more aware of that detrimental trend instead of the whatever political rhetoric manufactured by the U.S. politician.
Okay, Colin, we have to.
Yep. I think we've now got to the time to turn to the second part of the dialogue, which is really.
Excuse me, can I just add one point
Sure.
on this very critical question? I thank you, Hugh, for raising this very strategic question. Number one, I think the big debate has been going on during Joe Biden's administration, whether or not inside the White House, obviously there are two different views. President himself wishes to go along, but traditionally they don't want to clarify such an ambiguity. But I think the concern is when China can, in the past, the position was much weaker, but now China doesn't really care whether you make it ambiguous or clarify the position. So all along, the more important thing is the United States, Australia, Japan, and other countries would have to watch because at least from my understanding, China is looking closely. Even if ambiguity is there, the US has done whatever they consider necessary to support Taiwan. And I guess from now, it doesn't really matter for Beijing whether you keep a strategic ambiguity or clarity. So that is something changing a different time frame. Beijing is also moving much closer to the issue. More importantly, how we are going to work together. Thank you.
If I may, I'd like to have 1 minute.
Sure.
Right. I believe that U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity has worked for many years. And the step towards strategic clarity is only used as a bargaining chips. Recently, we heard Xi Jinping talk to EU by saying that U.S. is forcing me to invade Taiwan. I believe that has something to do with their perception from ambiguity to clarity. Lastly, I would just like to say the One China policy, each country has its own skillful way of zigzag through. The most important thing I would like to say that our regional partner can do is to facilitate peace, not war, in the region. And the One China policy could be a win-win-win platform, not a zero-sum game. Thank you.
Thank you, Manrung, for that. And that is a nice segue, I think, into the second part of the dialogue, which is how a country like Australia can move forward, if indeed it should move forward or can move forward in the sort of relationship it has with Taiwan. And I think the scene that's been set in the first part of the dialogue suggests perhaps a more difficult environment in all of this. So perhaps we now ask Saukit Tok to say a few words.
Thank you, Colin. And thank you for the panelists out there to share who have shared your opinions about what's going on here. I am a China specialist, so I'm not really an Australian foreign policy person. But let me just start by sharing with you what I think of what's going on at the moment. After President Lai was inaugurated in May, and then subsequently what happened in Chinese politics, in June and especially last month during the third plenum. Does Beijing like Lai? Well, obviously no. There's unmistakably no. I think he has a long record of being a member of the new type within the DPP. And for quite some time now, Beijing has constantly labeled Lai as a separatist as well as a troublemaker on various occasions. So that kind of like lay out the basic groundwork for their attitude towards Lai. But do they know Lai? I think they do Lai pretty well right now. I mean, having known him since his time as a mayor in Tainan, as well as his tenure as a VP to Taiwan, I think they know him. He's a known personality. And they do observe that kind of change that he took on his way to the presidential office with regards to Taiwan-Strait situation. Does that mean that Beijing knows what to do with him? Probably no, but it means that they are not dealing with an unknown person. I think that is a assuring thing. But what can Beijing do about him, about President Lai? Nothing much. They can't do anything much with him because my argument will be that Beijing's hands are pretty full at the moment. As we see in the third plenum that has just ended, okay, Beijing's focus is largely domestic, and the economic issues, especially high unemployment, youth unemployment, the busted property market, basically post-pandemic lethargy setting in China's economy at the moment, and apparently the Central Committee, the messages that were sent out through the third plenum, they aren't very confident about what is going to happen. They keep emphasizing about quality development, quality engagement, and even they talk about quality Belt and Road Initiative. But at the end of it is how to achieve quality was not really clearly spelled out. Okay, so I think there is a gap between what the CCP wants at the core and what they need to do. So I think also notably is that China has receded from international scene in the last few years following the pandemic. With the reduction of Belt Road Initiative, Xi Jinping has not been traveling abroad as often as he would before, as he had been before the COVID and things like that. So it's kind of like, showing that China is actually turning inwards rather than looking out and resolve issues like Taiwan. But at the end of it, I think the bottom line here is security. And when I mean security, is not the security of China, but security of the party that is at stake there. For the Chinese case is how the party hold on to its power remains a key determinant. And even the discussion about economics is really subsumed under this big matter. And the communique from the third plenum actually underlined this concern because one of the most important messages that was sent out was really that they need to balance up development, economic, social, political development with security. And by security, of course, they means party security rather than national security. And recovering Taiwan by force, and I'm glad that I agree with Professor Lai and Professor Yuan there that any war is not imminent in Taiwan, not the least. It's a very costly and risky endeavor for China. All right. There are cheaper ways, there are easier ways, easier things that the Central Committee in the CCP can achieve than to tackle the Taiwan. All right. But I do raise two questions here. All right. One question being, now, the first big question, would Xi Jinping's hubris actually get the better of rationality? Okay. It looks like by the communique that Xi Jinping is seeking for his fourth term. It looks like. And that will put him in a position to rule over China for 20 years, which is really unprecedented. Okay, that actually, that kind of, boost his ego to such an extent that inspires him to recover Taiwan, something that his predecessor all avoided doing. Okay, that's a big question out there. I couldn't answer, and I'm happy to let everyone chip in on that. Then the second thing is where does that leave us? Because the whole thing, ironically, is in Taiwan's court. Because both United States and China, as what Professor Yan has insinuated earlier on, is kind of like happy with the current status quo. There's a lot of continuity in the policies. And they kind of largely frame up the space within which they seek to play the Taiwan game. Okay. But the question there is, would President Lai be willing to tango along? All right. That inexplicably puts the ball firmly in Taiwan's court. And so far, China's reception to President Lai's inaugural speech seems to be cold, but not outright rage. I'll put it in that way. Okay, it's cold, but not outright rage. So it probably have not overstepped China's red line, or it has, in a certain way, China just doesn't want to be bothered with it anymore. Okay, but when is he going to test that water again? That remains to be seen. So I think that gives us some food for thought about what regional players as well as Australia can contribute to this dialogue. As in, like, I mean, I'm not going to give any suggestions here. I think I will leave to Beck and Hugh, who are really Australian foreign policy expert, to share their thoughts about it. And I'm happy to chip in afterwards. And yeah, Colin, that's all for me.
Thank you, Salkit. That's interesting that the view that you presented and the view that I think we got from EUAN. In China, the main concern is security of the party. In Taiwan, it's securing the next 4 years and beyond for the DPP. Both sides focused on their domestic politics, which is not surprising in any place when you think about it. Beck, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. Look, one of the things I think that I've been very interested in recently in terms of Australian foreign policy and some of the national security discussions that occur around Taiwan is really the status of discourse on Taiwan in Australia, particularly in the mainstream media. There tends to be, I think, a very narrow focus on when we talk about Taiwan. It's very much focused on conflict. There's kind of a sense of self-absorption in Australia thinking about Taiwan. It's like, how will it affect us? How might we be pulled into a conflict? How will it affect our interests? And there's also a kind of breathless reporting in some cases on the inevitability of conflict, which I think is really quite problematic. So one of the things that in terms of making recommendations to what Australia can do, the first thing that I would say is that we really need to alter the way that we talk about and understand Taiwan in Australia, and not just limit ourselves to thinking about it in terms of conflict, but all of the other ways in which we can develop a relation, or develop and strengthen relations, and to support Taiwan, that are not necessarily just about whether or not war is likely and what Australia's contribution might be. So there is, that's part of the reason why we're here today, I think, is to try to really broaden that understanding and to get more Taiwanese perspectives into the Australian national security conversation. It's part of the reason why La Trobe Asia last year, that the outfit that I run, interviewed Foreign Minister Joseph Wu, was to try to broaden our understanding in Australia of the complexity of Taiwan, understanding more about the domestic politics, as we're hearing today, and to be able to develop relations in other sectors. So I think we need to resist the sense that inevitability is the inevitability of conflict. We need to talk actually more about the cost of war for China, because that's something that's come up a lot in the discussion today. This idea that war would be costly for China, and that there are other ways that China is seeking influence. I think we need to, in Australia, acknowledge the importance and recognise the agency of Taiwanese people. Taiwan is not an object to be fought over, but it is a home of 23 million people. We need to understand Taiwan not just through the lens of competition between the United States and China, and we, I think, can do more to internationalise the issue and encourage other states to facilitate peace, as was mentioned earlier before. So this could be by adding the issue on the agenda of trilateral, multilateral, and minilateral dialogues. It could be trying to play an active role in advocating for diplomatic crisis avoidance and conflict avoidance mechanisms. It could be increasing support for Taiwan's involvement in multilateral institutions. It could be trying to develop strategies to enhance economic security between, there's an issue that Australia and Taiwan both face, is this, the need or the desire to reduce economic dependence upon China. That's a shared challenge, I think, but also encouraging, the people-to-people links, NGO fora, civil society. The point here, I think, is that there are a range of options and areas that Australia and Taiwan can collaborate on. That's not just about thinking about conflict and war. That, I think, is an important element of the conversation, and I'm sure Hugh will follow up with some discussion about that. But we need to be sort of changing up the conversation a little bit, I think, in Australia, and to be thinking more about Taiwan, in terms of what Taiwan is, not just in terms of whether or not what's going on in the region is going to sort of press Australia into conflict. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck, and I think you've raised some really important and interesting points there about the sorts of things that a country like Australia might do, encourage or try to help Taiwan join international bodies in some capacity, the World Health Organization, civil aviation, international crime. And then there's the question of a bilateral FTA, which the Australian government has been a bit cautious about. Taiwan's participation in some capacity in the comprehensive progressive trade Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are all things that we could look at, and I'd be interested to hear in due course the Taiwan side's views on that. Hugh, over to you.
Thanks, Colin, and can I just say it's a great pleasure to be here. It's part of this conversation, and I think the point that Beck has made, that there's a lot more to Taiwan and a lot more to the Australia-Taiwan relationship than just worries about war and cross-strait crises. It's a very important point to make, and obviously the Australia-Taiwan relationship has got huge dimensions of people-to-people contacts and trade and so on. But somewhat, I'm afraid, conforming to Beck's expectation, I am nonetheless going to focus on, so to speak, the strategic side of the picture, because it is, of course, a very important one. I mean, it goes without saying, of course, that it's very important to Taiwan, but it's also very important to Australia. It's become part of the standard conversation in Australia about our present situation as a country, that we face the most serious strategic risks since the Second World War. There's an interesting debate whether that's really true, but it's certainly a very widely held view, including on both sides of politics. And I think if you interrogated our political leaders or our analysts as to what they mean by that, you'd very quickly come up against the idea that the thing that Australia really worries about, and which is driving, at least rhetorically, a significant expansion in our defence posture and our strategic diplomacy and so on, is the risk of a conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. And it's worth making, of course, the point worth making in this connection, that our alliance with the United States is seen by us as drawing us very immediately into that into that possibility. And our alliance with the United States obviously frames our approach to the kinds of risks of it that of a cross-strait crisis or conflict that we might face. One way of thinking about that, of course, is that what's at stake in the possibility of a cross-strait conflict as a result of Chinese aggression against Taiwan is not just Taiwan itself. As Beck said, Taiwan has agency. It's not just an object for other countries to dispute over, but it is, amongst other things. It's not just that, but it is that. Because for reasons of history as well as geography, Taiwan and its position in the region has been, ever since 1949, a very important symbol for both the United States and the PRC of their respective relationship with one another, of their inherent contest as to which of them is going to be the primary power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. That contest submerged in the decades after 1972, but it's well and truly re-emerged now. We now have between the US and China a very active strategic rivalry as to which of them will be the primary power in East Asia and the Western Pacific in the decades ahead. And, for America, its capacity to sustain the status quo and preserve Taiwan's special status and its thriving democracy and so on is a really critical symbol for them of their continuing role as the primary power in East Asia. And for China, conversely, their capacity to, as they would say, achieve their goal of reunification is critical, I think, to China's ambitions to reclaim China's place as the leading role or leading power in our part of the world. And what that means is that the stakes are going up and the rivalry between the primary powers is rising. And indeed, one of the reasons why that's so risky is that both sides tend to use the risk of a war over Taiwan as a way of achieving their objectives vis-a-vis the other. I absolutely agree that with Beck and with others that the risk of war should not be exaggerated and that it's a very long way from being inevitable. But I don't think we should underestimate it either. But one aspect of that is that I agree with those who see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in what you might call a kind of a D-Day Normandy kind of model as a very difficult and demanding operation. But I do think if I was one of the PLA's military planners, I'd focus much more on the imposition of an air and sea blockade of Taiwan as a potentially effective military option for achieving Chinese objectives. And I'd be a little bit more pessimistic than some others would be that the risk of the kind of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine would deter China from such an undertaking. I think the historians are likely to judge that Russia has actually survived the sanction regimes pretty well, and that China is much more proof against that kind of regime than Russia would have been. So the big question, of course, is, well, might it happen? From an Australian perspective, the first point to make is that is a decision that will ultimately be made in Zhongnanhai. It will be China's decision as to whether or not there's a conflict, and which decision it takes, I think, will be very heavily influenced, overwhelmingly influenced by its judgments about how the United States will respond. The more likely that the more confident they are that the United States would, despite its strong statements from Biden that we mentioned before, that the United States would not respond militarily, then the more likely it is the Chinese would, I think, take the risk of launching military operations and vice versa. So a great deal depends on how credible America's deterrent posture is. I think in assessing that, we have to pessimistically but realistically acknowledge that America's deterrent posture has got substantially and steadily weaker over many decades as China's military, particularly its air and maritime capabilities, and now in particular its nuclear capabilities are growing. That means the costs and risks to the United States of resisting Chinese military operations against Taiwan are going up substantially. And now I think it must be taken to include the possibility of a conflict becoming a nuclear conflict in which Chinese nuclear forces are targeted against American cities. I think that must make us very sober about the credibility of American deterrence today. And then we add to that, of course, the peculiarities of American politics as they exist in 2024. On the one side, of course, the very obvious isolationism of Donald Trump, albeit not necessarily shared by others on the Republican side, and many who would hope to be influential in a second Trump administration like to proclaim that Trump isn't really an isolationist, he's really a kind of a Ronald Reagan in different garb. I think we need to be very cautious about that. I think Trump himself's tendency towards isolationism is very well established. But also, I think we have to recognize that even on the Democrat side, where the rhetoric of US global leadership, including its commitment to East Asia, including its commitment to Taiwan, is very clear, the rhetoric is very clear. I think we have to look at the concrete actions that have been taken by the Biden administration over the last 4 years, and indeed the actions that were taken by the Obama administration in the years after he declared the pivot in 2011. One just has to recognize that very little in concrete terms has been done to reverse that steady decline of America's relative position vis-a-vis China in terms of the military balance. So I think one has to be prudently pessimistic about how adequate US deterrence is, and therefore about the danger that the guys in Zhongnanhai will decide on balance that it's worth a try. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about that. I just conclude by saying that for Australia, the question of how far we go in supporting the United States in trying to strengthen deterrence, and how far we go in trying to in supporting the United States if deterrence fails and a conflict begins, constitute one of the biggest choices Australia has faced, perhaps in its history, certainly in many, many decades. And that at the moment, a lot of the discussion of that issue is focused around the question of AUKUS, the Australia-UK-US agreement to acquire nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, which, apart from being a very radical and ambitious, heroically ambitious capability development ambition for Australia, is also, I think, become the focus of a very deep discussion about the nature of Australia's future involvement in Asia and the place that Taiwan and Taiwan's future has in the evolution of the US role in Asia and therefore of the Asian strategic order. I better leave it there. Thanks, Colin.
Okay. Thanks, Hugh. Paul, would the Taiwan panelists like to comment or ask questions?
Yes. AI? Yes. Thank you for your thoughts. I've been thinking about in future tense. There is a judging, looking back what has about the bilateral practice between Australia and Taiwan, has achieved. I welcome very much about at one point the concept of agency, all right, versus a structure. Being a student of international relations, we are always looking for, especially for small power like Taiwan, we are yearning for the place that somehow that we could exert impact on the international system, and yet we recognize the room to accommodate our agency is very limited, and yet I would recommend it. Looking back, I had a very vivid memory about some 20 years ago, a scholarly by the name of Desmond Ball from your end, who has envisioned a cooperative effort with Taiwan under the aegis of a CSCAP. Actually, Desmond played a key role in facilitating Taiwan become the participant to that very regime. That belonged to the past. But I'm curious. I'm very like to see in the future that both sides of the Australia and Taiwan could do something in a similar fashion, not necessarily for military a war preparation, rather to create more to accommodate it, to make room to accommodate Taiwan in more peaceful way. I think Taiwan should be and has been recognized as a pivotal power when it comes to the international non-proliferation in the past. As I mentioned already, about under the aegis of Australia, the Australia Group, all right, has already raised create the possibility to accommodate Taiwan's future participation to the international forum. So this is important elements, and also I think and my generation also envisioned the very possibility for another 10 years under Xi Jinping's leadership. So that is why I'm very much think the current Taiwanese leadership, the leader, President Tsai, President Lai, he also very much like to prolong his political longevity by having a second term. So putting whether it's a 10 years time frame or 8 years time frame, where I think that there's a very limited time and space require a collaboration between the intellectual community of Taiwan and Australia to figure out a means to which that we could collaborate. So I'm very much to see like to hear from now on to have a more interaction with the party of concern about feasible target, about possible means through which that we could achieve something. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would like to say 2 points. Number one, even though both DPP in Taiwan and PLA in China are very much preoccupied by the domestic politics, however, the cross-strait relations will be definitely affecting the dynamics of their domestic preoccupation. So I do not believe that cross-strait relations will be stagnant in one way or another. Just as we speak right now today, we have both sides lower rank officials meeting in Kinmen, or Xiamen rather, resolving the boating, the fisherman boat incident that was very tense earlier, but now both sides tends to be eased off with compensation from Taiwan's side to the fishermen's families, etc. And also the upcoming few months, I think we will be anticipating more of the collaborations. Number two, I would like to say I agree with the analysis regarding that the cross-strait relations do not have to be in a tense or conflictory tone in nature when we talk about regional security or relations, since in reality, by internal necessity or by external pressure of sorts, Taiwan will witness a softening relations across the strait, and we should not take current affairs at face value. However, I do not believe that China will exclude the possibility should anything that they think cross the red line. And that I believe Taiwan has experience of self-restraint. What I'm more worried is that the foreign behaviors will be interpreted in such a way that they feel that they ought to act. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Manuel. Just on that point of red lines, as I understand it, the red lines that China might have set which would precipitate some sort of military action or otherwise aspired. If Taiwan were to declare independence, if there was massive domestic chaos, turmoil in Taiwan itself, and thirdly, if there was foreign interference, a third-party interference in the Taiwan Cross-strait issue. Now, none of those three is likely to happen, I can see, in the foreseeable future. So it looks like it's unlikely that red lines will be crossed.
Let me just say this. I think it all depends on the interpretation in that, for example, the regional alliance, whether it's the P4 or you have a new terminology, or whether the stationing, the purchase of weapons, and part of the reason that U.S. military hardware has been postponed for delivery, even though Taiwan has already paid the military sort of purchase, but the hardware is still on hold. So how do you define that red line? I think that's what we witnessing. The U.S.-China has a lot of dialogues, and also the military or higher official exchange between the U.S. and China, and that has always been a thorny point. Thank you.
So perhaps let me, in the interest of time, quickly respond to three wonderful presentations here. And I appreciate such an enlightening message and information. Basically, I concur most of the analysis. Number one, from Soki, whom reminded us Xi Jinping will be there for another 7 to 8 years. So basically, if we are talking about policy influence or policy making, we need to consider with our democratic election, perhaps until then we will have different leaders in your country and also in Taiwan as well. But basically, we need to learn for vis-a-vis China, the policy line will continue for some time to go. So basically, if this is a top message, we need to find a way to go around with it. And for Beck, I completely agree that since the strategic context is changing so dynamic outside of Australia and also in the Indo-Pacific region, so definitely we need to not just focus on military dimension, but also other. So there are so many things happening. If one thing I can suggest to consider, or maybe as a question to our three Australian speakers, looking into this geo-economic dimension, whether for now, RCEP or CPTPP, whether there would be a much more moderate way to include Taiwan into the picture. If we are thinking immediately, put AUKUS or even Quad on the picture, this will directly raise this confrontational approach vis-a-vis Beijing. So this will be a question for our three speakers. And also quickly on to Hugh's very profound presentation, thinking US-Australia allies. And I have been thinking that because in the next few months, we may be seeing such unpredictable leaders coming from the United States. So until then, a strategic picture will change dramatically. How exactly we can go via Australia, which are considered closest allies of the United States, and perhaps Australia can really contribute substantially to facilitating cooperation, which will come different from American first approach. So that will be, as I can see, more friendly and also more feasible in the region to come. So I want to also leave this question to Hughes, whether Australia can be delivering such a possibility. Thank you.
Hugh, do you want to respond?
Yes, thanks, Colin, and thanks to all of you. A really interesting set of observations. Before touching on the last question, could I touch on a couple of the other issues that have been raised, Colin? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Look, I think, thank you. Look, I think, you mentioned my dear late colleague, Des Ball, who did, of course, do a remarkable job in the way in which he contributed to the building of CSCAP. And it's worth remembering that CSCAP was part of a series of things that happened, particularly in the 1990s, when the whole region built a new generation of regional security architectures and forums and dialogues and so on. It was a very exciting time. And I think one way of thinking about the task we all face at the moment is how to regain that sense of dynamism in the way in which the region thinks about itself and talks about security questions, which has, I think, been very much sidelined as the rivalry between the US and China has intensified and increasingly taken center stage. And something that follows from that, like a corollary from one of the points I was making from my earlier remarks, is that when we think about how to reduce risks across the strait, it's the corollary of my argument that the risks across the strait very much reflect the underlying strategic rivalry between the US and China, is that to step back from those risks, it's necessary for the US and China to step back from their strategic rivalry. Now, it's a kind of a statement of the obvious, but it's something that's worth keeping on saying, is that we'd all of us in the region be a lot safer, and Taiwan particularly, if the US and China could find a way to negotiate a future relationship between the two of them in Asia, rather than continuing to just battle about it. And now I do think that the idea of such a deal is very hard to achieve, but it's certainly worth our while trying to think through how that could be achieved, what kind of mutually acceptable vision of their respective roles in Asia could be reached, and how that might work for other countries in the region, including middle-sized countries and entities like ourselves and Taiwan. That does bring me to the thought about whether there is a scope on the economic side as well. I do think that for Australia, one of the disasters of the last few, or misfortunes perhaps I should say, of the last few years has been the way in which the very dynamic regional evolution of regional economic institutions has become sidelined or derailed even by the escalation of strategic rivalry. And that brings me to your final question about what could Australia do to help perhaps ameliorate the consequences of a less predictable leadership in the White House. In fact, I'd make the point that what strikes me about the Trump administration, if we get a second Trump administration, is not that it'll be unpredictable, but that it'll be very predictable. And it will be as scary as we all think it will be. Look, that's a very difficult question because, as Colin mentioned right at the beginning, Australia in all of its approaches to these questions has to bear in mind, amongst other things, that China is our biggest trading partner, a very important country to us in many dimensions of our national life, and not just economically, but demographically, strategically, and so on, and that we will be constrained in the way in which we can contribute directly to Taiwan by the reality of our need to make that relationship with China at least work reasonably well. I don't think any of us hope it'll go back to where it was before. But I do, on the other hand, think that a great mission for Australia is to do whatever we can to contributing to the evolution of a wider strategic order in which the question of Taiwan ceases to be the very difficult and dangerous flashpoint that I believe it is at the moment. And I think that's something that Australian political leaders have not yet, I think, really grasped. It's very easy for Australian political leaders to talk in broad terms, as our foreign minister does, about the idea of a future order in Asia in which no one dominates, no one is dominated, and so on. But in terms of actually starting to use our imaginations to try and conceive such an order and help to bring it about, I think that's something we still haven't yet done enough to do, and I think that's something we should really be focusing on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hugh. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. Could I just pose one sort of propositional question? It seems that in the past, and Hugh has alluded to how things seem to work better in the past, but there was also a period when cross-strait relations were easier than they are now. There was the consensus on the one China principle. Each side agreed that there was one China, but had differing interpretations of what it meant, and that seemed to ease cross-strait relations quite a lot. It was during that period, I think, that, for example, New Zealand and Singapore were able to negotiate free trade agreements with Taiwan. Now, any suggestion of a free trade agreement with Taiwan seems to incur great wrath from China, which has obviously made the Australian government nervous about that. So all of these things, it's like a game of three-dimensional chess. There's US-China, huge consideration, but there's also Taiwan-China and what the two sides of the strait do. So, I mean, I'd personally like to see an FTA with Taiwan. I'd like to see Taiwan in the comprehensive, progressive trade Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'd like to see Taiwan more active in the ICAO, in cybercrime, in the World Health Organization. All these would have a definite interest for Australia. We would benefit from Taiwan's participation in all those areas. But Australia has to be mindful of the response from China and how much flexibility we actually have. And that's a really difficult consideration, and we are on the side of caution, obviously. So can I just put it to the Taiwan panel? What would you expect from Australia? What would you like to see from Australia, given this somewhat difficult, fraught position where flexibility seems to be difficult?
Okay. Well, I would like to say this. Australia has been for decades the forefront mover and shaper of Regional Economic Forum, and Colin, your good self, has been chair of the APEC Secretariat, and then has already also in East Asia, you have ambassador for many countries. So what I'm trying to say is that in terms of FTAs, your keen observations is absolutely right. The difference between Ma administration, where we can forge bilateral and quite at ease at multilateral economic schemes, including APEC and then the WTO, and then for Tsai's administration, the strong belief that Taiwan should go to the world and coming back to deal with China. And Ma's approach is that cross-strait relations first, with the understanding that Taiwan is not going to the world to challenge one China policy. And then that's why you have identified the success under Ma administration of bilateral and multilateral economic advancement. And I was lucky enough to serve my angel at the National Security Council, charting out all our international organizational paths. So what I'm trying to say is that the different approaches result in different outcomes. And if we are not going to deal with Beijing, at least ease of tension with Beijing, we're not going anywhere. Because New Zealand and Singapore have, at that time, very frankly, unlike some of the trade partners, they're shy to tell us the reality. They told us at the time that China-Singapore free trade agreement precedes Taiwan-Singapore comprehensive economic trade agreement. New Zealand told us frankly as well that our way to forge FTA with Taiwan has to have a note from the Beijing, whether you like it or not. Let me just stop here.
Thank you, Manrung. Time is almost up, and I think maybe we need to sort of just finish with a few concluding comments. I'll just say very briefly that I think the last hour and a half has demonstrated, how fraught all of this is, and it's not getting easier. And for third countries like Australia to develop relations with Taiwan, it's going to become harder. The flexibility is going to be harder to come by, and that's something we all have to deal with. And I think we'll all watch with interest what happens in the United States later this year with the election and the impact that might have. But it just seems to me that the new administration, or the Lai Ching-te administration, is probably not going to create an environment where there's going to be greater flexibility for third countries like Australia to develop relations or whatever with Taiwan. And I'll just end on that note. Paul, have you got some parting comments?
Oh, thank you. We are very happy to hear opinion from our Australian side. Time is too short. Maybe we can have a next one soon. So like I mentioned yesterday to you, a stable Australian-China relationship is good for Taiwan too. So we'd like to see your administration, your Labour Party administration is very good now. So we'd like to see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think that is stabilization of relations between Australia and China has been an important achievement or continuing effort by the Australian government, and all of that can perhaps have a positive impact with cross-strait relations very indirectly. I don't know, but I think we're, from Australia's point of view, we will always proceed cautiously in developing our contacts with Taiwan, but they are important contacts. We're an important energy supplier. Our LNG supplies, I think, are quite vital for Taiwan. So all these things will go on, and I think we just take it step by step. But it's not going to get easier. That's my concluding comment. I don't know, has anyone else got anything else to say on that note? I think it's an optimistic note, or semi-optimistic note. Perhaps we can conclude and thank all the panelists, and thank you for your time. And I hope the people watching and listening to this have found it useful. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank